Today I want to look at a book in particular. I'm going to give you basically a brief synoptic version of a book by James K.A. Smith. I think I've mentioned him in the past. I've probably mentioned him a few times. James K.A. Smith is a professor of theology at Calvin College, which is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And in my opinion, Jamie Smith is just one of these guys he's some of the best secondary sources that are available. So when somebody wants to get to know some big thinker and their ideas, sometimes we're a little scared to go right to the primary source. I encourage you not to be afraid of that. If you want to read Augustine, go read Augustine. It's important that you kind of get used to the language of some of these thinkers. But Jamie Smith just has this amazing ability to kind of distill other thinkers and bring them down to a kind of level that's understandable, palatable, and useful for us to know. And so he wrote a book quite a few years ago. I think it came out in like 2006, called Who's Afraid of Postmodernism? And he had a follow-up book to that called Who's Afraid of Relativism? They're kind of sister works in a way. And he breaks down, I think, the postmodern situation. When I say that, I mean where we are today. He kind of asks the question, when are we? That's how he wants to situate us and say, we need to ask this question, when are we? Where are we in the sort of historical timeline of church history, and what are the issues we're dealing with? And we talk about, how do we do church in a post-Christian age? That's sort of the language that's out there. And I think it's a very good question. And so this book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, I want to explore today because I think, honestly, when I read it, I have to be honest, it was one of these kind of amazing, startling realizations where somebody was saying everything that I was saying, just from a different angle. It was like I had written my dissertation and basically came to the very same conclusion that he had come to. And so I just think we think alike, and so I want to use some of his work, and I do encourage you, if you ever want to read some of his stuff, he does some great things. Another great book by him, by the way, is called You Are What You Love, and we'll talk a little bit about that. They all kind of flow into each other. So today, talking about where are we in a post-Christian age, and what do we do about it, and some things that the church can wrestle with and think about, but also understanding what postmodernity is. Postmodern, that just the term, is a difficult, amorphous, vague terminology. It's used to describe all kinds of things, and the reason why it's so hard to pin down is because there's kind of a debate over whether or not it really means what we think it means. When you talk about postmodernity, there are different ways of expressing the postmodern in art and architecture and the novel and writing and philosophy, and they all are a little bit different than each other. They overlap, but there's a little bit of difference to them. And one of the debates that you hear about postmodernity is there's that question of it's a postmodern. So we have to define what is modernity. What is modern, right? And you think about modern art, right? That might give you everyone knows what I mean, I think, a little bit by modern art. It's the stuff that you find in the Tate. It's the art that doesn't make sense, right? It's the art that you look at. And Dali here is actually kind of a good example of modern art this is the surrealist form. Dali was playing with, contorted images, right? If we think about the period just before it, and you think you're coming out of the Enlightenment, and you're talking about reason and rationality and form and structure, and everything having a kind of a ground in reason, then modern art was moving away from that. And so I use this painting today because in a way it's descriptive, if you will, of some of the Christian situation in a way, where what we have is a sort of distorted Christ. We can't really see his face. We're not really sure what to make of it. And yet he is drawn toward the world, being pulled almost by a gravitational force to earth and to the immanent, right? And so again, it's playing with that tension of immanence, transcendence that we've been sort of talking about. So let's get into where we are. When are we, right? in a post-Christian age. A few definitions I wanted to go over. This is Charles Taylor. I've mentioned him a few times. He's the one who wrote that massive book, A Secular Age, exploring sort of the idea of how, 500 years ago everybody was a believer and now it seems nobody is. And how did that happen? And when he talks about secularity, we talk about ourselves living in a post-Christian or secular age, but what do we mean by secular? And helpfully, I think Taylor outlines sort of three basic definitions that have evolved. They've changed over time. So secularity meant something very different, again, 500 years ago. You would really define the secular today, for instance, has sort of a negative connotation, especially when we talk about it in the church, right? We talk about, well, the secular world is the non-Christian world. In the medieval period, for instance, secular just refers to non-church work, right? I mean, if somebody is plowing a field all day, that's secular, right? And what the priest does is a religious vocation, and those two things are separated. So that's kind of secular one, is this division of public spaces. Secular two, then, is this next move to a decline in belief and practice. And you see this happening in the Enlightenment period, in the scientific revolution. There's suddenly this skepticism, a deep skepticism that sort of enters in about authority. And what have we been told, right? You see the Protestant Reformation kind of bring this into the fore, right? People should have their own Bibles. Why are we listening to this one authority, right? And there's a suspicion of the Catholic Church, and there's all this, right, that tension. And so we move now into a second kind of phase of secularity, a decline in belief and practice. And that eventually has got us to this third secular place, secular three, which is where the cultural conditions are such that unbelief is now a viable option. And what's interesting about this thesis, I think, for some people to hear is that we kind of take it for granted that that's just a position people could hold. But I've mentioned this a few times already, but 500 years ago, as the thesis goes, it's kind of impossible to imagine yourself as an atheist. You can't really conceptualize, not in the way we have today. That's why the atheist movement that occurred after 9/11 with they're called the Four Horsemen. You might know some of these names: Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett. Those were the kind of four guys. They were known as the New Atheists, because it was a new brand of atheism. It was an atheism that thought of itself as a non-position, right? I'm declining to believe in something. But again, that's a completely new phenomena. That's not possible 500 years ago. And there's been a number of people who have written on this, that conceptually, you can't imagine a world that isn't enchanted in some way. And that's the language of Taylor. He talks about the enchanted age and then a disenchantment that happens. And he talks about the self as moving from what he says is the porous self to the buffered self. And so this is what's happened over the last, again, I'm saying sort of roughly the last 500 years, is that 500 years ago, and maybe a good way to explain it is to say, if you walk home at night and aren't afraid that you're going to be possessed by a demon, you don't live in the same conceptual world as people in the medieval period. That's their cultural imagination. We don't live like, and so what he means by porous self is it's the self that is affected by the spiritual world, that it can be persuaded, moved, manipulated by the forces that are around it. But as we develop this skepticism, we come out of the Enlightenment period, what happens is we start to buffer ourselves. And so ideas, the spiritual world, whatever you call it, is something that sort of pings off us now. And we choose whether we want to accept that or not. I choose whether I want to be affected by the external reality or not. Everything becomes a more internalized dialogue. We're more autonomous. There's a decision to be made. I can decide whether I want to believe in God or not. Okay, what does that make God if you can choose to believe in him? That's really a question that, in a way, is new. That's an advent. That hasn't happened before. There's a reason why the Bible never talks about proving the existence of God, right? There's one verse in Proverbs where it says, a fool believes in his heart that there is no God. And many have made the distinction. It's purposeful that it says believes in his heart, because the idea was you couldn't in your mind, conceptually, really believe there was no God. But you could fight against the belief in God in your heart because, maybe you're like Job and you're upset that God's done something, okay? The cultural imagination has shifted. And we now live in an age where atheism seems to be the default, right? That you have to sort of be brought into the religious atmosphere in order to be a Christian, right? You're not born into that environment. And yet, we're dealing with the tension of the fact that we've had 2,000 years of Christianization in the West. So Christianity has permeated the kind of ways in which our thinking and our ethics and our humanitarian efforts and all these things, our institutions, in the ways they've all been established. And now we sort of have taken it for granted. And I think you hear that, I mean, in my personal opinion, it's just a naive thesis that, oh, well, we would have got there anyway without religion. As a matter of fact, religion poisons everything, right? That was Christopher Hitchens' big line. God is not great. Religion poisons everything. And we need to ditch the old Bronze Age myths and get on with, right? And I think he's being proved wrong just empirically by what you see in culture today, right? If you remove religion, people do not default to rationalism, okay? They default to all kinds of insanity. You will see wild things being, made up about what defines a human person and we can get into all those issues. But you can see that it's not like everybody just agrees on something. And so here's where I want to get into Jamie Smith a little bit. And what Jamie Smith is doing is he's taking postmodernity. I mean, the title kind of says it all. Who's afraid of postmodernity? In many ways, the idea of the postmodern has become for us a bit of a bogeyman. How do you say that? Boogeyman. Thank you. Bogeyman. I play too much golf. I'm afraid of the bogeyman. I don't want to hit bugs. The boogeyman. That postmodernity, especially for many Christians who have really imbibed and sort of become more modern than we might think, that we've become quite modern. We're allergic to this idea of what the postmodern wants to do. And I'm just kind of summing this up quickly to begin. We'll break it down. But that what Jamie Smith is trying to do here is to say, actually, postmodernity doesn't have to be this bête noire, this total enemy, and it also doesn't have to be our savior. It can just be something helpful. It can be very helpful for us. And he uses the language from Augustine. He rips this from Augustine, which I think is it kind of encapsulates everything we've been talking about too. Is Augustine had this line of looting the Egyptians of their wisdom. What does he say? I have it written down here somewhere. Making off with Egyptian loot. Okay, and what he was saying is, as a Christian, look at Moses in the Bible, who's raised in an Egyptian culture. Well, it's not that he ditches everything that Egypt ever had to say, as if they had no wisdom, and that if all truth is God's truth, they have to say something that might be right. But we need to understand it under the umbrella of the Christian understanding of revelation in the world. Right? But I've been saying this kind of the whole way through, right? When we talked about, let's say, Greek thought and philosophy. It's been integrated into Christian thought, and I think it's been helpful, right? Now, we have to be careful of a sort of syncretism where those ideas start to dominate the Christian revelation and worldview. But Jamie Smith's point here is to say that postmodernity is actually offering us a very useful critique, and we have to pay attention to it. And if we don't pay attention to it, we do so at our own peril. Because one of the reasons why, and we'll look at this, one of the reasons why postmodernity as a concept, as an idea, as an age or a movement, whatever you want to call it, or how you want to define it, one of the reasons why it's so dangerous in many ways is because it's right about a lot of its critiques. And when you apply it to just, again, when it infiltrates sort of the secular world and you don't have the Christian religious basis on which to kind of work with those ideas, it can take different paths, nebulous paths. And so postmodernity, from the philosophical standpoint, what we'll get into, has definite issues with it. Jamie Smith, myself, we're not going to say agree with these people all the way down, but we also want to take some of the things that they've said and understand them a little bit more clearly. So this is what Jamie Smith does in his book, is that he puts out, using the three kind of main figures of postmodernity, and let me just explain that in philosophy. Postmodernity sort of begins, if you talked about it as a philosophical movement, around the 1960s, 1970s, largely by a group of French intellectuals, okay? French Enlightenment thinkers, really, okay? Post-Enlightenment thinkers. And the three that are named here are Jacques Derrida, Francois Lyotard, and Michel Foucault, okay? So Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard are the three sort of names that represent at its height postmodernity in philosophy. And all three of these sayings, we sort of talked about them loosely. And today what I want to do is kind of follow Jamie Smith through his book and talk about these and see what do they really mean and how can they be helpful for us. Because what his thesis is sort of based on is saying, these are bumper sticker slogans. That's what he calls them, right? We've used them as these bumper sticker slogans. And by doing that, we've reduced the meaning of what they are, and we've turned them into a sort of enemy when they don't really need to be. We can make off with some Egyptian loot here, okay? We can actually plumb their depths and gain some resource from them. So does that make sense? So we're going to go through some of these. Let's start with a quote, because this is part of his diagnosis, and I'll break this down because I think it has a lot to do with what we've been talking about recently. Jamie Smith says, our Christian faith, and correlatively our account of apologetics, I want to be precise about something here. Part of the issue that Jamie Smith is bringing up about postmodernity is that the Christian church, we Christians, have actually become so modernistic, so rationally based, so we've moved so far away from the idea of myth and the language of myth that we've embedded ourselves into the scientific worldview that indeed apologetics, the idea of the defense of the Christian faith on reasonable premises, becomes all of what theology is. So when he says our Christian faith and correlatively our account of apologetics, he's sort of saying all Christian faith in the modernist world and in that view sort of tends toward an apologetics. It's like that's all Christian faith becomes, is just defending the faith on the basis of some scientific rational enlightenment worldview. That makes sense so far? I just want to break that down. So he says our Christian faith and correlatively our account of apologetics is tainted by modernism when we fail to appreciate the effects of sin on reason. When this is ignored, we adopt an Enlightenment optimism about the role of a supposedly neutral reason in the recognition of truth. We also end up committed to Constantinian strategies that under the banner of natural law seek to build a Christian America. Maybe we need to stop there too and kind of take note of what he's saying. Part of what postmodernity is trying to critique is this idea of a neutral reason. That if we all just agreed that reason has no influence, our subjectivity doesn't influence reason. It exists and it stands alone. And then if we all just followed reason, if we all just followed the logic, we'd all arrive at the same conclusion. And therefore, Christian faith can just be argued for on the basis of this reason. And if you're a smart intellectual person, you'll just come and agree, right? We all know that's not really how people come to faith, right? That's not really how it works. I'm not saying it's ineffective all the way down. You might listen to people like William Lane Craig on the internet give defense for the Christian faith. I've spent a lot of time with William Lane Craig, actually, personally. I find him very helpful for Christians who have just got their foot in the door because it can help ground faith. I'm not saying it's irrational or that faith is against reason. We're never saying that, right? Reason is the handmaiden of theology. But arguing for the Christian faith as though it's set up on the premise of some kind of exterior reason that's universal and everyone, right, without people's experience and subjectivity being involved, that's a problem. And when you adopt that, you actually end up doing you do eisegesis to the Bible. You start reading yourself, you start reading your own, this is the truth. And that's how you end up with a Christian nationalism. That's how you end up with God's on my side, right? And he's going to save America and make it great again, and that's how we're, right? That is a purely modernistic way of looking at the Christian faith. And so this is what he's saying, right? We end up, when we have this idea of a supposedly neutral reason, then we become committed to Constantinian strategies, right? Going back to Constantine, empire, this idea that somehow power and authority can kind of control what the church is doing. All right, I hope that makes sense. To put this in more familiar terms, classic apologetics operates with a very modern notion of reason. And this is what I talked about last week, presuppositional apologetics. That's what we're trying to do. That's what Jamie Smith and myself, that's what I was trying to explain last week. And this is where I found myself when I was reading his book going like, wow, we really are talking about the same thing. We talked last week about presuppositions, that it's all really about your presupposition of what constitutes reality. What is the Bible? What is it God's word? And if it's God's word, does that mean you can understand it perfectly, or does that make it all the more complex? Right? We talked about realism and idealism as sort of philosophical landing places. Well, if your presupposition lands you in an idealistic framework, you're going to think very differently about the Christian faith than a realist would, okay? Now, and I'm not telling you necessarily that every Christian needs to think through these philosophical categories. I'm using them as an example. The point is if you are committed to, if you've imbibed the modern worldview and think that there is this neutral reason out there, and then you're a Christian based on that, well, you're going to have a pretty dogmatic faith, it sounds like, all the way down. That can't be moved, that is, that negates entirely other people's interpretation and experience of what it is. And what we talked about, just to kind of make this clear again, is we said it's not any of that. It's not, I talked about last week something called conciliatory realism, the idea that Christian faith is based in realism. It is based on the fact that there is something out there that just is the way that it is. But that our approach to it and our interpretation of it still matters. And how does that make sense? I know that this is all very kind of confusing stuff, but the idea of presuppositional apologetics is being juxtaposed here against the modernistic neutral reason apologetics, okay? Presuppositional apologetics, on the other hand, is postmodern and Augustinian. So again, he's kind of aligning. He's saying, actually, what the postmodernists are talking about was something Augustine was already doing, okay? Insofar as it recognizes the role of presuppositions in both what counts as truth and what is recognized as truth. For this reason, postmodernism can be a catalyst for the church to reclaim its faith, not as a system of truth dictated by neutral reason, but rather as a story that requires eyes to see and ears to hear. The primary responsibility of the church as witness, then, is not demonstration, here's the logical proof that I can show you, but rather proclamation. The charismatic vocation of proclaiming the word made flesh rather than the thin realities of theism that supposedly neutral reason yields. Okay, mouthful there, but I hope you're getting kind of the point. This idea of the modernistic approach, neutral reason. We can just argue for the Christian faith and everybody should get it. One of the things that he's also saying here, and he's aligning himself with the ideas right now of Blaise Pascal, who is a medieval thinker, Christian thinker, Catholic thinker, that the idea that the God of the Bible is not the same as the God of philosophical theism. This needs to be accounted for. By the way, I keep mentioning William Lane Craig. Do you guys know who I'm talking about? Anybody? He's a major apologist, and I think his channel is called like Reasonable Faith. And a very smart guy, studied in Germany. He's considered in many circles as one of the top theologians in the world. But he's very much doing a modern project of apologetics. He's arguing for the existence of God. He was the guy who did battle with all the new atheists. He would debate Christopher Hitchens and all of those people. And when you're debating the existence of God, he's using a lot of philosophical arguments, right? But the philosophical arguments, what they lead to, you get led to a God of first cause and primary mover, and we use all that language, but there's kind of a distinction here to say the God of the Bible isn't quite the same as just the God of philosophical theism. The God of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is different than the Greek God of Socrates and Plato, okay? There are distinctions to be made. And so, again, what Jamie Smith is sort of getting at is that apologetics, the church doesn't have an apologetic, it is an apologetic, okay? It lives it. It proclaims its story. It lives in a way in a community that then affects the world that can see it and hear its proclamation. And that's sort of a different thing, if you will, right? Kind of makes sense. Everybody tracking with me? Any questions at this point? I realize we're sticking more to a text today, so stop me at any point if this is getting a little bit too heavy or needs more clarification. So again, the modern understanding of the church. What is it really produced? Well, for one, there's been this emphasis on the individualism of the church. We think less in terms of the community as a whole, as the body of Christ, and more as a group of individuals who are getting together. And so the church begins to be formed in these sort of consumeristic ways. I talked a little bit about that last week too, the influence of the economy and the influence of capitalism. And again, that's not making it again another boogeyman. It is not turning capitalism into just like that's the problem. And I'm not saying that. It's being aware of the fact that those structures do affect the way that we think about our church. They affect our presuppositions about what the church is, right? And so we're all affected by this to a degree. That many people who come to church are doing it in a way to fulfill their consumerist desire, right? They think of the church as providing put on the show for me to experience, right? And that needs to, in a way, change for us and how we think about it, right? People either come to get answers to questions or to fulfill those consumerist desires, is what Jamie Smith says. He says, Christianity becomes intellectualized rather than incarnate, commodified rather than the site of genuine community, right? So that's a modernistic mutation of the church, is this idea of individualism, turning it into a product that is, and that's where we church shop. We're like, this church doesn't fit me, I'll go to this one instead, and then, right? And that can be an issue. That can definitely be an issue. And so in a way, there's some things here, there's all these rabbit trails you always want to go down, and I just want to be careful of doing that. But what Jamie Smith is actually bringing back here is a maligned formula that would say there is no salvation outside the church. Has anybody ever heard that before? That's an old Catholic credo kind of thing, right? No extra ecclesiam nulla solus. There is no salvation outside the church. And obviously some people were in a way offended by that. Like, you're saying God can't save people just because they're not a part of the... What Jamie Smith is doing is he's defining church differently with a capital C, right? That this is the body of Christ. It constitutes all of us as a community, right? That the church itself is the site of renewal and regeneration. That it isn't about you as an individual just coming here to get your intellectual stimulation and emotional, feel good, whatever, reset the battery and leave. That's not what this is. That we are the body of Christ. We are connected to all other Christians. There is a deep unity that's involved here. And so, of course, to say there's no salvation outside the church is simply to say that we all function as members of one body, and that it is the church where is that within that community, that's the site of renewal. Okay. How's that for... Any questions at this point? Any clarification of anything that I'm saying? Any confusion about what I mean by, maybe we haven't defined modernity, post-modernity quite well enough yet. We're going to kind of get there. But, yes?
Kerygmatic definition.
Yes, kerygma.
What was it?
The definition of kerygmatic.
Kerygmatic, or kerygma. The kerygma is the proclaimed gospel in the early church, right? So it is, we have the Bible, we have the text, we have the scriptures, but the kerygma is the proclamation of the text, the actual speaking of it. It's being heard by the people, right? And so that's basically what that refers to. And so that's what Jamie Smith is referring to, right? That we are proclaiming this. We aren't just arguing for it or demonstrating it. It's a little bit different.
Okay, I missed a lot, obviously.
Yeah, I know we've done
I see here that you put the kind of Socratic Greek God early in the timeline. Mm-hmm. I'm interested to just kind of review that because
sure.
I think one of the challenges for me has been the dissonance between what seems to be the Old Testament God and the New Testament God, and and I wonder about that lineation, and I wonder if that presupposition that we talk about. Of Jesus at the time may have been informed a little bit by that.
I think you're absolutely right. That's a great question. And so I think that's definitely there. That we have to understand sort of New Testament theology and what is being proclaimed with the coming of Christ as fitting within the presuppositions of an Old Testament community. And that's what I talked about in the previous weeks that I think was important for unpacking this, is the way in which we sometimes read the Bible in a problematic way, where we read it in this linear fashion of like, okay, we got the Old Testament, we got the God of the Old Testament doing some weird stuff, and then Jesus comes along, and that's, if you want to get to know Jesus, then we go read the New Testament. And really what the account is different than that. The Gospels are unpacking the Old Testament. It is never, what Paul receives about revelation from Christ, right? He is always saying, it is what I've received in accordance with the Scripture. Paul knows the Old Testament. It does not lead him to Christianity. It leads him to persecute Christians. It is only until the Old Testament is revealed in the light of Christ for what it really is that Paul understands those texts now in a new way. And that's where we talked a little bit about allegorical reading, and that is what allegorical reading means. It's what it's doing. That we don't go actually to the New Testament to read about Jesus. We go to the Old Testament to read about Jesus. Because, and that's the allegorical approach. So there are presuppositions there in the Hebrew understanding of what God is, and I think sometimes we impose our modern reading on it and go, well, the God of the Old Testament is a really... Now, I gotta be careful with that, because people have said this for centuries, right? In the early church, there's a heretic named Marcion of Sinope who did the same thing. So it's obviously not just purely a modern invention. People always thought about the God of the Old Testament kind of along those lines. And the question is, how do we break that tension? How do we read it differently? And I think what's helpful is to go, the gospel itself is the proclamation unveiling who that God truly is. So every time we read the Old Testament, we're confused by these passages of like, why is God doing these supposedly horrible, evil things? We have to fit that under the banner of like, well, what did Christ say, right? So that we can, it's a weird way of, you're not trying to move away from the language of like God said it, but we have to recognize that maybe the God of the Old Testament is understood in much bigger terms than the way I think we think about some guy in the sky dictating things according to his sovereign judgment, right? In a way, I mean, I want to be careful about how loosely I speak about this, but in many ways, you can kind of read the God of the Old Testament as being the one in whom everything providentially holds together. And in a sense, what that means is, if it happened, God did it. Right? Like if it occurred, then it's God somehow responsible. And that's sort of the revolutionary thought that the Hebrews bring in. I hope in a way that can help ease the tension in a bit, because what I'm saying is that there's in the Deuteronomic law, there's a sort of deed consequence effect of nature. And it's just, so when you hear about God being like, I'll kill you if you touch the base of the mountain, right? And we go, that's pretty strict. And it's like, you might think it's pretty strict if God was just a guy in the sky gatekeeping, but really it's about a natural law that goes like, you do some things at your own peril, right? There's a lesson to be learned here, and that is but it doesn't take away from the revelation of Christ is explaining who God really is, right? So the God that you've read about in the Old Testament needs to always be seen through the lens of Jesus. And that's the allegorical reading. The allegorical reading is to say there's another way to read the Old Testament, and it's the one that reveals Christ. Okay? I don't know if that totally easy. I mean, I'm not here to solve that problem entirely. There's a reason why that tension's there. But we have to think along those terms. Augustine thought along those terms. Very interesting. Go read Augustine. He'll talk about like when you reach those passages where it's so difficult that you go, why is God doing this thing? It looks evil. He says, then you read it allegorically. It's his answer. Right? Some of us go like, oh, isn't that negating, are you not taking responsibility for what's there? And it's like, well, no, not entirely. I don't think he's evading it. I think he's rightly saying like, well, we need to be informed by this picture of a peaceful Jesus. So, like Noah's Ark, another great example of something of the flood comes and it kills everybody. Right? We read this story to children, okay? And we go like, we don't use the word genocide, but that's what's going on. Like, did God cause that? And in a sense, again, we go back to this, like, I'm explaining it in the way of like deed consequence. The world was violent continually. What does violence lead to? It leads to destruction, right? That's just the necessary consequence. And the allegorical reading would be Christ is Noah's Ark. Jesus is the ark that saves, that can pull people aboard, that can bring life, right? It's another reading. It's not the only reading. It's not, it's not against the literal reading. It is simply, that's another way of reading the text. That's a very difficult thing. But I hope I'm sort of massaging it a bit, I hope, to kind of go, well, there's other ways of reading the Old Testament. And until we kind of figure out that there are other ways of reading it that reveal who Christ is, we're always going to be caught in that tension. And that's what Marcion, so Marcion as an early heretic did exactly this. He was an anti-Semitic. He got rid of the Old Testament. He was a bit of a Gnostic too, so he believed like God of the Old Testament's a bad God, and then we have this good God in Jesus. So whoever Jesus is praying to as the Father can't be this Old Testament God. This is early, in the 2nd century of the church. He removes the Old Testament, gets rid of a lot of Paul's letters, cuts down the Gospels to just Luke because he's the Gentile, right? All the other writers are Jewish, so you got to get rid of them, okay? And he redacts and he changes all of these things. Well, Marcion's problem is that he's a literalist. That's his first problem, is that he's a literalist. He's reading it. He can't understand, he's even questioning. He's like, why is God in the Garden of Eden guessing where Adam is? He's God. Doesn't he know where he is? And it's like, wow, you're really missing the point of the, But that's it. It shows that the problem's been around since the early church. And it's all about how do you interpret this, right? And so we need to sort of have an elevated reading of Scripture and to be careful to pay attention to those, those difficult passages and not try and evade them, but to read them in the light of Christ. That's a difficult thing to do. That's what we're here to do, right?
Simplistic example?
Yeah.
So simplistic answer, or question about that, Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel, yeah.
Yep, gets built, man's got some idea that he's got it all sorted, away he goes, builds a Tower of Babel. God says, nope, tower's destroyed,
Yep.
you'll die, bad things. So is this a new life through death reading of this?
I think absolutely that could be brought into the text, right? And that's the sort of creative enterprise of how does one go about the allegorical reading and do that responsibly? And that's sort of where we are now, is figuring out how to do that. But it's been done. That's exactly what has been done. Paul reads the text allegorically, and sometimes we just shy away. We're like, well, we're not Paul, we're not the apostle, so we better not do what he does. But are we not supposed to follow Paul in the way that he reads the text? So are we not able to read it that way? I read once a very interesting thread on the Tower of Babel that really explained, I think, rather well that, on first glance, that story looks like, why is God destroying this for their business savvy and their ability to build a tower? And really, if you read into the language and understand the Hebrew and what's really happening there, it's because that the whole story of the Tower of Babel is actually how it's built on the backs of slavery. Like it's about oppressor and oppressed, and about the fact that it's like, you might build this kingdom to heaven, but if you do it on the backs of others through violence, I will tear it down, right? And again, you can kind of see that's sort of built into the fabric of things. There's a deed consequence narrative within the Old Testament, right? But I've always tried to understand, it's been one of the ways, and I'm really speaking for myself here, I'll just say this is kind of my way of interpreting it, is that when I put God of the Old Testament more in the scope of, it's not that what the Jews were saying about him was false, it's not that they were wrong about it, but they're describing God in maybe a much different way than we do as people who tend to anthropomorphize and turn God into a much smaller, a big me in the sky, in other words, right? So, and you can kind of see that. I mean, one example, for instance, would be like when he sends the plagues to Egypt, right? And it says he hardened Pharaoh's heart, right? And you see that verse sort of repeated in Scripture. When Jesus says it later on, he says, do not harden your hearts, and we use that language. There's this sense of, how is Pharaoh responsible if God hardened his heart, right? It says God hardened his heart. So is God just doing it too? And in a way, I might be wrong about this, but it's been one of the ways that I've tried to ease the tension for myself of going like, well, maybe if it's understood as God is what's responsible for everything. And so if God can do no other than be love and truth and beauty and goodness, then he is the one in anything that is enacted by God, any revelation of God, which brings those things forward, is going to cause the hardening of an obstinate heart. Because anything, if you're Pharaoh and you're like dead set on, I got to keep my slaves and do my thing, then the entrance of that revelation of goodness is what will harden your heart. So it's God basically taking responsibility for the fact that it's like, I am definitely the reason why your heart is hardened, but that's still on you, right? It's just because I entered into the equation the goodness and truth that is my very being spoken into existence, and you're resistant to it. Now, your resistance to it is still the result of my action. So God is hardening his heart. But right? But do you see now? You understand the language. It's not God magically zapping Pharaoh and going like, his heart's now hardened, so he'll never change his mind, right? It is simply that is what an obstinate person does when met with the revelation of God, right? Which is predicated on the mercy of, let my people go. I've always found that to be helpful enough for me, right? And then you can kind of see where Christ can be read into this, of the liberation, the freedom. When Christ sets us free, we enter into our own exodus. That whole narrative is imprinted. The New Testament is playing with that theme constantly. Last week we talked about John 9, the man born blind. That's exactly what happens. The man born blind receives his sight. That's his freedom from slavery in Egypt. It's the same thing, right? That's the allegory. What happens to him the moment he's freed of his blindness? He enters into exile. He's threatened by the Pharisees. They want to kick him out of the community. He nearly loses his life. What happened to the Israelites in the desert? They grumbled, it'd be better to be back in slavery, right? It's the same story. John 9 is Exodus, right? That's what I'm trying to say, is like we have to read the Gospels as opening up these texts, right? That's a different way. Yeah. You want a mic?
Yeah, I had two.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, Ben, thank you very much. I'm really enjoying this. I had 2 points that came to mind as you were speaking.
Sure.
And I'll try to just keep it short. One is the Danish church, where it's the Lutheran church, and people are born into it. It's very hard to get out of it.
Yeah.
So often when you're trying to get out of it, you realize, I probably do believe anyway. This is what I'm hearing from my son.
Okay.
And his common-law wife who lived there. And the other point I wanted to make is about the financial markets and the rules. I took a course about insurance companies, just how hard it was for people in the early church to accept insurance, because they thought, well, if I trust God, he'll look after me after someone in the family dies and things like that.
Right.
And then real estate. There are so many rules for housing. So there's just, the whole impact of financial markets in
the
our
biblical
North American...
Is that what you mean, in the biblical time or even currently?
No, in the current time.
Yeah.
So in the postmodern...
Oh, yes, yeah.
Our modern time, we have structures and ways of looking at things.
Yeah.
So some people would say, oh, you're very naive if you just stay in your house and you don't go out and try to educate yourself to get a job.
Right.
Those kind of things, and you just wait for the money to fall in your lap. So anyway, those are just 2 points I had. And how do we feel about that? Because clearly the African church is going to be far different than the North American church, who plays by these rules in the banking system.
So what I'm hearing then is basically you're talking about being kind of born into different environments that have an effect on you in a certain way. Is that kind of what you're saying?
And how do some of these scholars relate to that? Because I know in some cases people try to stay within a church and stay apart and stay different.
Yeah, right. And sort of silo themselves into a certain community. Well, we're gonna talk about it a little bit. We're gonna get into this idea of sort of...
We have like the Danish church on the one hand that thinks your education, everything you do is part of God's plan, and we try to make it as robust as possible. And then we have maybe silos. So, it's just sort of interesting.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about community of belief and interpretation and how that all works, because if people are born into a certain environment, I heard you say, it's hard to get out of it and stuff. It's not impossible, but it's, and there's a sort of question of how do you adhere to those truth claims. I don't know if I'm really getting at any of your point there, but I think hopefully...
How do you keep your faith anchored while you're
Oh, I see more.
See these rules as being
So,
beneficial
and this is kind of what we're doing and what we're going to explore a little bit more is I think one of the ways in which you do that is by knowing exactly where you stand. I think, part of this is a descriptive task of kind of going through our church history, trying to understand it as best we can to realize, like, why do we think the way that we think? Like, I have a friend who's a pastor of a Protestant church, and he kind of grew up in the charismatic Pentecostal world. And once he started to get educated, he had a crisis of faith. And his crisis of faith was like, do I need to become Catholic? Like, no one told me. And my answer, of course, was, of course you don't need to become Catholic. That's not, it does, a lot of people do. They start to study and then they realize there's this whole tradition and maybe I need to go back. But no, you don't need to do that. You just need to understand why you're a Protestant. You just need to be able to answer that question. Most people just kind of float around and just like, a church is a church, and they don't really think about their denomination. And maybe they shouldn't. I mean, to a degree, I'm not telling you to take that too seriously. But you kind of know where you stand. What is it that, what got us here? Do you know how the Baptist church was formed, right? I mean, like, it might be important to ask those questions if you're going to hang out in a Baptist church. Not because you're looking to flip tables and change things. I'm not saying that. I'm just going, it's important to know where you come from. Part of what I was saying about our consumeristic way of looking at the church is maybe the better model is to find the church that's in your neighborhood and go there. Or actually, Dan, you're a good example of somebody who, like, this is the church you were raised in, basically, right? And so, like, in a way, I'd say it's incumbent upon you to, you stick with this community, right? As best as you can, right? This is the bride of Christ. You got it, through better or for worse, this is my community. And so it's working in that and then educating yourself to kind of be like, well, where do we stand here? What do we, what's been influencing us? What are the different things? I think that's kind of the answer. I mean, it's just to inform ourselves. And that's why a descriptive task is sometimes helpful. That's what we're doing by doing the presuppositional apologetics. Why do we think the way? Why are we asking the questions we're asking? That's kind of the way at it. Question there.
As I've been thinking about myself and where I come from, and looking around the room a bit, I think I'm very much a product of the modern era. That I think of myself.
We all
being
are.
Of a certain age. Yeah. Well, being of a certain age,
Sure.
From childhood of the '60s, and as being a science guy, I'm kind of thinking I'm someone who's used to. There's right and wrong, and there are certain ways of doing things, and there are absolutes, and there are things that are foundational and things we should hold on to and believe in.
Yeah.
And then this postmodern idea of where meta-narratives get criticized. There are no absolutes, and there are no solid foundations, and that makes me very uncomfortable.
Okay. Yeah.
And the idea of there being positive in postmodernism, I think you're heading there, but I'm very interested to see what the positives are in postmodernism. So
let me we're going to get right into that now, and let me just address it kind of briefly, because you've put your finger on exactly the right thing. But the problem there is that's why Jamie Smith's follow-up book is Who's Afraid of Relativism? Because what we've done is we've turned postmodernity as a sort of the bumper sticker slogan of, nothing outside the text, incredulity to meta-narratives, all this kind of stuff, as if it's saying no foundation. And the truth is that if you take it as the bumper sticker, as much of the culture has, that is what you end up with. But the point that I'm trying to make here, along with Jamie Smith and others, is that it doesn't lead us to relativism. There are right and wrongs. There are absolutes. It's that those absolutes are conditioned by subjectivity and community and interpretation. Doesn't mean they don't exist. It's just that we have to work through the interpretive problem, right? And that's kind of what we're getting at. So it's very good. There needs to be that recognition that modernity is not being somehow treated as just this total enemy. It's less that. It's more so it's just not the whole picture. And that's the idea of conciliatory realism. That's why I use that terminology, is to say, as Christians, it is realism. It exists whether I like it or not, right? When I confess Jesus is Lord, I don't follow up by saying, and that's just my opinion, right? Christ is Lord or he's not. That's true. Has to be. But to understand that is qualified by a communal grammar and by a way of interpretation. The Jesus I believe in is given to me through a portrait of the gospel. It's through an interpretive lens, and that's what we're going to get into, is that what we need to take from postmodernity is this idea that you cannot escape interpretation, even science. Right? Science, this is what Jamie Smith gets into, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but the moment science tries to justify itself, it's now entering into philosophy. And some people just go, well, I just trust the science. That's called scientism, and that's its own ideology. And it's a philosophical construct, whether people like it or not. And it's an interpretive framework, and it's a poor one, right? You need the religious.
Well, something else about science and coming from the science era is the need to feel like we need to understand and explain everything. You have to have an answer for everything, and sometimes those answers get reduced to simplistic answers that sometimes blow up because sometimes the answers aren't simple.
Totally.
So maybe one thing which may be positive is being a little more comfortable with mystery, and that there are some things that we don't necessarily fully understand and know, and maybe those crises of faith where you encounter something that, well, I don't know that I can explain this. Well, maybe in the postmodern era, that's less an issue.
I think that's exactly, I think you're right. I think there needs to be way more, that's exactly the new atheist critique as scientists when they want to critique religion, is they're accusing the dogmatic presentation that thinks they're just right about everything and what we want to do is enter back into this question of mystery, maintaining mystery without somehow turning it all into, and this is what, if we can get into Jamie Smith, I think that's what he's trying to answer. He's saying, the emergent church, which we talked about in week 1, was the idea of sort of let's do religion without religion, right? Let's get rid of the specific, let's enter into the mystery, guys. Let's just do the mystery. And what Smith and myself would be saying is, that also doesn't lead anywhere. That's floating in space. You need to ground yourself. You need to come back to a realism. You need to actually, and what for the conclusion is going to be here is that postmodernity, to be a true postmodernist actually, is to lean more into your tradition and more into your confessions unapologetically. That you return to the basis of the creeds and proclaim them as true, right? But we understand them perhaps a little bit differently. So let's get into that. That's the diagnosis. This is Jamie Smith, by the way, and this is his solution. There is no better way to face postmodern situation than by recovering tradition. No more effective means of discipleship than liturgy. This is another one of his big ideas he plays with when he wrote the other book, You Are What You Love, and he talks about this idea of homo liturgica. Human beings are liturgical beings. We're not brains on sticks that you just give information to and then we behave a certain way, right? Information doesn't always change people's ways of being. They're more dictated by their habits of behavior. And so it's important that the church has certain ways of acting and behaving. We do communion. We do baptism. We do preaching and worship. That's all liturgical. It's all purposeful. There's an act involved, and that's actually how we learn and are dictated, right? And so he always made this, one of the arguments he makes in there that I've always, I really liked is the idea as well that it's just, we are by nature, we are religious beings. You can't do religion without religion. Just understanding what religion means, the idea of binding together and having a sort of, but everybody is, I make the joke of you talk to a person who's, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. And it's you're standing in line at Star Wars, you're religious. Okay. You follow a certain mode of behavior and have a highest good and a highest aim, and you think through religious terminology, you just don't call it that, right? But I mean, it's hard to escape that, right? You have to serve somebody. You have to have a highest aim. That's, again, a kind of the simplistic way of putting it, is, right? If you're an atheist, but then you're still holding to some kind of ultimate ideal, or you want to say all human beings are equal, right? It's where's the ontological ground for that statement? That's a religious sentiment, Accept that. So we confuse it sometimes with thinking it's all about ritualistic patterns of behavior. So anyway, that's all that to say, because I think this is a good question and the tension that we're sort of getting at. Yes, I realize these are interesting images to pair alongside each other. That we are trying to ground ourselves. We are trying to have a faith that is confessional, that believes things, that has a place to stand. It's not relativism that we're aiming at, but we do need to recognize the sort of the more deconstructive, if you will, elements that make our certainty in things. Perhaps certainty becomes not so much the right word. Perhaps that's why we lean into faith and believing. That the axiom of the church, if you will, which was made popular by Augustine and later by Anselm of Canterbury, is the idea of fide quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. That's the mode and model of the church. That's kind of what we're leaning to, or what I'm trying to say with all of this. We have faith comes first and then understanding. It's after, I believe. Remember week 1 with the polls of is theology just a philosophy that you just have the tools, anyone can do it? Or is it about belief, right? The church has always understood itself as once you believe in Jesus Christ and confess him as Lord, then understanding comes, right? Think about, again, use that as a reading of John 9. Look at the blind man. He didn't ask to be healed. Jesus' revelation comes to him. And it leads immediately to a sort of confusion. It's only through the progress of the text that his sight is gained more and more. His physical sight is the first thing that he receives, but it's that's the least important sight that you can gain. The more important sight that you gain is of who Christ is. And that is a progressive understanding. And that is sort of a model for what I'm saying about conciliatory realism. It's real, it's true, it's bedrock. You can't argue with it. But how to understand that is something that is shaped throughout your entire life. There's a mathematics, or you might know this as a scientist, the term asymptotic, right? Something constantly moving toward its endpoint and never quite touching it, just getting infinitesimally smaller. That's sort of, in a way, the Christian life. You are always moving toward Christ more and more, trying to grow into him. You'll never reach the fullness of it this side of life. You could. And that's the reason why that term exists there. I mean, right? It's always new discovery. But that doesn't mean you have nothing to ground yourself on, right? It's precisely because I have something to ground myself on, that I have something to aim at, that I have something that I'm reaching toward. It's just that thing is always bigger. It's infinite, right? The love of God is infinite. And so that's, again, I use the phrase from Ben Myers, the Australian theologian. I love it, where he says, we never go deeper than our baptism. At the end of the day, we can get into all of this philosophy, we can do all this theology, we can plumb the depths. We're only plumbing the depths of the core truth that we know that a child can understand, that Christ loves you and has died for you. That, the central message of the gospel is, in a sense, utterly simplistic, right? I used it in one of my sermons recently, but it's the story. Karl Barth, the greatest theologian of the 20th century, wrote, Church Dogmatics was 6 million words. He said he never wrote a word that wasn't published, okay? He's just so prolific, it was insane. And deep theology, dialectical theology, this heavy philosophy, so well classically trained, he was just a brilliant mind. And at the end of his career, he was asked, can you sum it up? What are you really trying to say? And he said, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. It's that simple. It's that simple. And so at the end of the day, I think we're only going to the complex places to derive from it what is core, essential, simple. That's another one of those paradoxes that exists in the Christian faith. It's he has given this wisdom to infants, okay? It is not and that's why what we're kind of saying as we walk along this is demonstrated so well by that painting we were talking about just earlier at the beginning of this class. By where is it? I have too many slides. By our Caravaggio there, right? The triangulation of reason, which you see in all Renaissance painting, right? The Last Supper, it's triangulated. Triangle stands for reason, right? It stands for concrete, true, stable, right? And it's saying the triangulation is flipped on its head. It's there still. Reason exists. It can't be irrational, okay? Christian faith isn't meant to be irrational. It's not meant to be the term fideistic. Faith doesn't just trumpet and do whatever it wants. It has to be reasonable. But revelation contradicts our natural reason. It's keeping it intact while flipping it on its head. That's kind of how I look at it. And that's just an important way of, it means that your confessions of faith are never so stable that they can't be pushed further, right? Anyway.
I think as we talk about science and this idea that it represents this kind of departure from faith, but it could actually, maybe in the early stages of Enlightenment, it kind of was a departure from the literal interpretation.
That's
But
right.
it seems to me that the more science progresses in its discovery, it kind of brings us back, and more evidence for intelligent design.
I think you're totally right.
Is brought. So, and maybe the postmodern kind of movement is towards this kind of emergence of embracing both.
Absolutely. I think when we understand this correctly, there is zero tension between science and faith. Zero. Absolutely none. As a matter of fact, and it's not just that there's no tension, it's that they work harmoniously together. And it's the Christians who created the Enlightenment. I mean, like, it is, in a sense, like, at least that's an argument I'm making. I mean, some people might scoff at the idea, but I'm saying without biblical revelation, without the idea that there is a creator God who put the laws of the universe in place, giving it for you to discover, you wouldn't have these people wanting to discover these things and exploring the universe, knowing that they could find reason in it. That's actually given to us by God. Anyway, I just think that's important. Maybe we should take a break because I realize we're, once again, haven't really got right into, but no, this was really good though. I think this was a helpful kind of, we're clarifying a little bit of what's been talked about here. And now we're going to get into, we'll just do the three bumper sticker slogans and clarify what they kind of mean. So yeah, we're going to take a look just kind of briefly at these three thinkers, Derrida, Lyotard, Foucault, the postmodernists, and kind of the three main or more popular phrases that they kind of threw out that have, in Smith's opinion, been used as sort of the bumper sticker for understanding how they've defined postmodernity. These are features of the postmodern. And understanding it a little bit differently, going, well, maybe there's been a reductionistic sort of view of what they're saying, and that's led to some, problematic conclusions, but we don't necessarily need to do that. We can actually find what's helpful in them. So the first thing is from Derrida here, Jacques Derrida, who, this sort of the main figure of the postmodern movement in the sense that it was really his philosophy that sort of sparked this whole turn. And it's also where you get the term deconstruction. So when we talk about deconstruction, that term's been used a lot in the church. And it typically refers to people who were born into the faith, probably born into a pretty rigid fundamentalist kind of understanding of the faith, and then they get older and they're in their teens or they go to university and they start questioning stuff and they go through this deconstructive process. That's not quite what the philosophical term means. Using deconstruction that way, in the way I just explained, is really just questioning your beliefs. That's all essentially that is. Deconstruction in the philosophical sense is a sort of way of destabilizing meaning and then reconstructing it again. So there's actually the idea of a deconstruction. You're actually supposed to construct something from this is actually what's coming out of the philosophical idea. And we get this in this phrase. I'll try and break it down kind of simply and then move into a bigger way to understand it. But the idea that there is nothing outside the text. Derrida is essentially saying that all of the things that we say and attribute meaning to, every definition we have, is just defined by other words, which then also require other definitions. And we get into this sort of circular pattern of using language. And so because everything is embedded in our words that we have defined, then there's nothing really outside of a constant movement to different words and signifiers and symbols. And so everything is sort of destabilized by this process. But we want to give a little bit of context to this. So when Derrida is making this statement, he is invested in a conversation with the Age of Enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So this is Rousseau. Rousseau was actually Genevan. His ideas very much influenced the Enlightenment and then later the French Revolution. And Rousseau has this idea of an unmodified state of nature. So he was in a debate with another philosopher named John Locke. And with John Locke, you get the idea of something known as the tabula rasa, the idea of the blank slate. Maybe you've heard of this before. The idea that human beings are basically born as blank slates, and that then society and nurturing from your parents and the values that they instill sort of fills that blank slate as a receptacle. Rousseau didn't buy that. He didn't think we were blank slates. He thought in an unmodified state of nature, we are inherently good. We inherently sort of know both good and evil. We have a tendency to know that. He referred to children as noble savages, right? We might not be educated yet, but we kind of already have something instilled in us that knows these things. And then society creates a sort of obstacle where it modifies those beliefs and changes those sorts of things. So this idea that you're a blank slate and everything's being poured into you is something that Rousseau is pushing against. And of course, I think we kind of know that to be true, right? If you talk about, I have a 3-year-old daughter, and it's amazing to me how much is sort of like imprinted in her already. Like you're like, she's just that way. That's her personality, and I don't think she got it from me or from anyone else. There's a sort of an instinctual way that she already is. Yeah, wait, just wait, I've been told, yeah. I don't know, I'm hoping she mellows out. Her middle name is Wilder. I did this to myself. I did. I told my wife, I said, if we have another child, we're naming her Serenity Naptime. And hopefully, what's in a name? Hopefully it works. So Derrida is involved in this conversation with Rousseau. About a sort of unmodified state of nature. And he's asking the question, is there really anything that we don't interpret, though? Is there actually this unmodified state of nature? Do we ever have something like that? Or isn't everything that we face in the world sort of interpreted and given to us through this other kind of lens? Is there ever an undefiled state where interpretation is no longer needed? Is that ever the case? And I think Derrida has something critical to say to us that he's saying in many ways, or at least, and I would say this is what Jamie Smith is sort of saying, deriving from Derrida, that we as modernist Christians tend to read the Bible with a sort of Rousseauian naivete. That we read the text as though it's something to get through in order to get to the real content. The text itself, the language, is a hurdle we have to jump over. And I've sort of talked about this in previous weeks, that like when we look at where every year there's a new magazine on the real historical Jesus, right? This idea that somehow Jesus is something that is behind the text. And when Derrida says that, he means it in a quite radical way, that there is nothing just behind the text. Everything comes through the interpreted language. Maybe we need allegory, right? But the point is that we look at it as though it's this code that needs to be broken. And in other words, what ends up happening is that our default is to think that we actually don't need to interpret things. When you read the newspaper, you're not reading it necessarily to interpret anything. You're reading it to get the facts, to be informed. And that what ends up happening is that we tend to read the Bible the same way. So that we might look at, okay, there's the Song of Solomon, and that one's a little bit weird, so we don't really understand that one. But forget the Song of Solomon. When it gets to Paul, that's pretty straightforward. Now I'm reading the newspaper. And we have to question that presupposition, because that's not what's happening. I'm not saying that Paul isn't a little bit more clear in what he's stating, but the idea that you're reading Paul somehow unaffected by an interpretive framework is just false, is kind of what's being brought to attention here. And I think that's worth noting. There is no place outside of interpretation. And that's the Rousseauian naivety, right? That somehow we can just understand the world as it is, right? And so that's where Derrida is saying no, and I think in a helpful way. You can never really get behind the text. There's always going to be this interpretive framework, right? It's language all the way down. And so saying nothing is outside the text means that everything is a text. Everything must be interpreted to be experienced, right? And so he uses this example, and I know it's an odd one. This is Jamie Smith uses this example of The Little Mermaid, okay? And in The Little Mermaid, everybody seen this movie? An old classic, maybe. The whole song about it's a whole new world, and she wants to constantly get out of this world that she lives in and go explore the more that's out there, right? I want to go where the people go. I want to go see what they're up to, and I want to do their things. And so what does she do? She starts visiting the surface and collecting these artifacts and trying to figure out, like, what are these things used for? And so she always goes to her friend Scuttle, and Scuttle becomes this interpreter for what it is. And so she goes and she finds a fork, but she has no idea, what is this fork, right? And so Scuttle looks at it and kind of examines it and tries to reason and says, well, it's called a dingle hopper. And he, starts brushing his hair with it, right? And so, of course, sure enough, when Ariel finally gets into the real world and she loses her voice, and that's the whole thing, that's her trade-off. She can become a human if she loses her voice. She ends up, going to dinner with the prince or whatever, and she starts brushing her hair with the fork, okay? And the kind of illustration or the point that's being made here is that we always have this assumption that we're not really interpreting. When you sit down at a dinner table and there's a fork in front of you, to you it's a fork. But the speed at which you make that connection doesn't change the fact that that's still an interpretation. And the point is that somebody coming at it from a different experience actually doesn't know it to be that. And so just because you're doing it so quickly that you don't consider it to be an interpretation, don't fool yourself into thinking that it's not. It actually is, right? What is the objective truth of the object is decided upon by a community that has agreed this is a fork, okay? And so when you say, like, is it wrong to brush your hair with a fork, that's a communal decision. We have deemed it improper together as a society. That's what we've agreed upon, is the use, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's exactly how somebody is going to approach it, right? So truth in this regard, what Derrida is kind of pointing out is that he's saying there's a distinction here. Truth is not exactly the same as objectivity, right? Those things have to be sort of understood a little bit differently. And so I think, this goes back again to week one, what I was saying with the sort of two theological poles, right? That not everyone can see necessarily what the believer sees. Here's where I think the church can benefit from this understanding, is that what we see, the language that we use to describe our faith, is something agreed upon communally. And I think that's where, one of the things that's been so important for us in the modern age, or where we are now, is ecumenism and church unity and coming together. If you read all of the scriptures about the unity of the church, I think sometimes we think that that's just an impossible goal and that we can't do it, that we would actually agree with each other as Christians over what we believe. But that's Paul's prayer for us in almost every one of his epistles, right? Have the same mind, right? Be of one mind, encourage each other and agree with each other in a sense, right? That if anyone preaches you a different gospel, that is anathema. You have to agree upon these things. We need to come together. And so it's a language that is embedded into the community, right? Or it is we as Christians who define that grammar and come up with, in a sense, the rules for what do we mean by these terms. Paul repeatedly emphasizes these conditions are themselves a gift. In other words, the presuppositions and horizons that make it possible to properly read creation are grace gifts that attend redemption and regeneration. So just the way in which people approach different things. I remember I had a friend in high school who was a German exchange student. And he came to, we had a party on the weekend or something like that, and he came to one of the people's houses. And he saw a baseball bat in the foyer, and he immediately was startled. He was like, and the reason was because he thought the sight of a baseball bat meant that, like, is your dad in the mafia? Like, does he beat people? Because they don't play baseball in Germany. If you own a baseball bat, that's what it's used for. I mean, now I don't know if that's true of all Germans, but that was his interpretation of seeing that object, right? And so we can see even in our kind of world, people interpret things differently. And again, do you understand, again, it's not getting away from the objectivity of the thing, but it is saying that the truth of the matter and the objective referent are parsed out, right? So that's what Derrida really means, is that when he says there's nothing outside of the text, he himself simplified it to say, all I'm really saying is there's nothing outside of context, right? There is nothing outside of a context. Everything is embedded within a contextual framework, right? So Derrida, this is a quote again from Jamie Smith, Derrida emphasizes that there are important, legitimate determinations of context. In particular, the context for understanding a text, a thing, or event is established by a community of interpreters who come to an agreement about what constitutes the true interpretation of a text, thing, or event. And that, we were talking about that. I talked a little bit about, for instance, George Lindbeck and in week 1, the idea of post-liberal theology or narrative theology. And again, this is the idea that they're playing with. We're back to the philosophy of Wittgenstein, language games. If you want to know what a word means, don't ask for its definition, ask for its function. How does it function in the world? What does it make people do? So if we turn God into the modernistic philosophical theism God, what does that offer people? When you say you believe in God, does that mean you believe in an abstract concept, or does it actually make you behave a certain way? Does belief in God entail that I act and exist in a community using, that I behave in a manner appropriate to that belief? That's what communicates it. That's what, in a sense, establishes its truth. Make sense? Sort of? Okay. So that's the first one. And so there's a way in which Derrida is pointing to the fact that things are simply contextual. This does not need to lead to an immediate relativism that says there's no meaning found in anything. It's simply saying all of that meaning is through an interpretive framework, and so you need to understand what your basic assumptions are, right? And this might be a bit of circular reasoning, and that's okay if it is. I'm okay with it at least. But what I would say is that sometimes we approach the Bible with our presuppositions, and really what I would advocate for is saying allow the Bible itself to form those presuppositions. We're talking about people kind of going, you were asking, Ann, about people as they could continue to study, and how do you hold on to your faith as you go deeper into these things? Well, one of the reasons why there was even a wariness for people, especially, the fundamentalist parent who didn't want to send their child to seminary because they were worried they'd lose their faith. That's a story I know all too well, being in an academic institution. Part of the reason for that is because that person has already decided and told the Bible what it is, right? And they've already determined this is what the Bible is, this is what faith is. And now you, theologian, you're going to play with those ideas. And essentially that's what happens, is that a theologian might open something up, and if you've already solidified where you stand, that's like kicking the slats out from underneath you and everything topples. And for many of us, it's so deeply connected that we can't question one part of our faith without the other. And that's why I see so many people. Like, for instance, I've talked a little bit about, and I'm really sorry if this is, by the way, if this is something that even maybe you struggle with, but I've talked a bit about the idea of young earth creationism. That I've seen many people just white-knuckle that, to, wrestle it to the ground. They will not let go of the idea of a young earth creation and the fact that science is somehow opposed and wrong, and that the earth is not 6 billion years old, it's 6,000 years old, and that's because the Bible says it. And to me, that's just, you're holding on to this, you've told the Bible that that's what it, it's not the Bible telling you, it's you telling the Bible that's what it is. And so I need to hold on to that. And if anything removes that and you have to re-question it, it's so foundational to your faith that you have to throw everything else out. It's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You can't, some people have such a difficulty modifying any part of their theology that it's like, if I'm wrong about that, what else am I wrong about? And then they start connecting it to all these other things, and suddenly their faith implodes, right? But what we want to try and do is be critical and receptive without throwing things out. This is faith seeking understanding. You have to start with the belief, right? Start with the context. Start with the fact that, well, this is interpreted. Well, who do I trust as the interpreter? Maybe the tradition, maybe the faith community that's established certain things. And that's why it's important that we go back and do this genealogical task, I think. This historical work of like, well, what did Augustine say about it? And I'm not saying Augustine's right about everything. I disagree with Augustine, but why? Well, because there's other members of the community who say other things, and there are other movements, and they're right. And interpretation matters. Interpretation just it matters because it's inescapable, and that's essentially what we're getting at with this point one. Any questions about point one, or any unease with it? Because I can understand that this sometimes can... But do you see where Derrida is not necessarily, the point is, he's not necessarily pointing us to relativism. If you take it as a bumper sticker, that meaning is just constantly, we're sort of oscillating always between definitions, and you don't have a sort of religious substructure to hold on to that gives you this kind of basis of understanding or a ground to stand on, you can see how Derrida can lead to relativism, right? You can see where it's just, now there is no truth but my truth. And there is no, do you get that? Do you see how that could be embedded? Because it's not necessarily what Derrida is pointing at, but it's what can be reduced and taken and run away with. And so I think you'll find that out in society. And as we go through these next two thinkers, I think you'll see it more and more. So the next one is about meta-narratives. This is Jean-Francois Lyotard, and his line again was incredulity towards meta-narratives. What does he mean by that? Well, we begin with, and here's another movie example. Has anyone seen this movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, by the Coen brothers? Great movie, right? I was going to say Smith uses his first example here. He talks about Little Mermaid as an example, but he also uses the movie Memento by Christopher Nolan, and I was just telling Dan, I haven't seen it yet, so I didn't want to, it's a complicated movie. I didn't want to try and use the analogy because I didn't know all the ins and outs of it. Meta-narrative is, again, one of these sort of misunderstood terms because in the French, when he had said it, the French can be translated to sort of big story. That's all it really means, big story. And a meta-narrative is essentially any, at least in this understanding, it's any story that is sort of overarching and complete that grounds our knowledge of something. So a meta-narrative is the big story we tell ourselves, right? And the bumper sticker slogan here then seems antithetical to the Christian faith because what's a bigger meta-narrative than the Christian faith? Right? Christianity is telling some overarching story about the way things are. And the idea is that in the postmodern age, because of this destabilization of meaning, we can't just trust any one meta-narrative. There can be no isolated reason that is aside from context that we can all just point to and agree with. They're always going to compete with each other, and no one's going to be satisfied. Okay, so that's sort of the issue. That makes sense. That the postmodern sees because of this destabilization that we can't just point to some big narrative to explain everything. Okay. So postmodernity can be understood as the erosion of a sort of confidence in the rational as a sole guarantor and deliverer of truth, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. And it's coupled with this deep suspicion of science, particularly modern science's pretentious claims to an ultimate theory of everything, okay? And so in modernity, the idea of a grounded reason, we can all just be reasonable, is, in a sense, a meta-narrative, all right? So incredulity toward meta-narratives is incredulity toward the big story. Make sense? The overarching big story. And again, what we have there is the boogeyman, right? That Orthodox Christian faith, in a sense, actually requires that we get rid of meta-narratives. This is the argument that James Smith is going to be making, is that it's not antithetical to faith. It's actually the very thing that faith is saying. We want to get rid of the big story. How do we understand that? One of the main reasons is because Lyotard here, he's not referring to the story's scope, but more so its manner of being presented. So that's the problem with the interpretation of meta-narrative as a big story, is the problem is it's not about the stories we tell, but the way that we tell them, okay? The way that we tell them. When a story appeals to some kind of external rationality that makes grand totalizing claims about reality, that have universal pretensions, and if only people followed the logic, they would end up there. That is the meta-narrative, okay? So here's the example, and here's the sort of analogy, is that in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, you have this, George Clooney's character is, the story, by the way, in this is Homer's Odyssey. So Homer's Odyssey is actually it's like a mock Homer's Odyssey is what the Coen brothers have done here. And so you have a Ulysses character because that's actually his name. His name is Ulysses Everett McGill, okay? And he is a runaway criminal who gathers his two friends here with a promise of, like, if you come help me out, there's this treasure that we're going to find. But really his motivation is he's trying to stop his lover from getting married. That's his whole thing. So he's trying to travel across and escape prison. He's a fugitive on the run, right? And throughout the narrative, what you kind of have is that Everett McGill is a sort of rationalistic Enlightenment modern thinker. And he is suspicious of all of these people who use their superstitious understandings. There's a whole scene in the movie where actually the two companions there go and get baptized in a river. And he just looks at the whole thing and scoffs, right? You two are dumber than a bag of hammers, like it's that. He wants to use his reason to get through things. But at the very beginning of the movie, there's this sort of prophetic oracle who gives him a word of something that's going to happen. And basically what occurs is that even though he's got this rationalistic modern mindset, he is constantly haunted by this other ulterior kind of fatalistic understanding of the world. And in a way, what's happening is that the analogy is that Ulysses Everett McGill represents sort of the postmodern figure who awakens into a reality where he hasn't been able to really, he thinks he's still this modernistic person, but he can't get away, he can't shake the sort of spiritual other reality that's sort of impinging upon his life, okay? And so that's what this, I'm trying to explain this as best I can, that this is really what this movie is trying to sort of uncover, is that in the postmodern critique of incredulity toward a meta-narrative, it's not the faith that is the meta-narrative, it's actually the very worldview that Ulysses Everett McGill is holding on to. He's telling himself a grand story about the way things are. He's the one who's trying to, and so in a sense, incredulity toward meta-narratives isn't a fight against the Christian faith, it's a fight against the new atheist who is actually rejecting, right? It's their dogmatism, in a sense. Is that making any sense? I'm trying to explain this without reading right from my notes here, and I find that's always the tension, because I'm really trying to get across Jamie Smith's ideas. So again, we're back into this idea of that our truth being embedded in sort of context, in language games. Incredulity toward meta-narratives is itself, and this is one of the things, it itself is just another meta-narrative. That's, when you take it as a bumper sticker slogan, the problem is it reverts into it. So the idea that somehow incredulity toward meta-narratives means we have to disassociate ourselves from any particularity, any story that is grand and overarching, is itself just another meta-narrative. It's just the negation of one, right? You're just moving into, you're doing the same thing by negation. And so there becomes an argument. It's one of the reasons why postmodernity is such a hard term to understand, because part of the argument that's being made is postmodernity is really not postmodern at all, if it's understood that way. It's just hyper-modernistic. Make sense? It's doing the same thing over again. And is that what Lyotard was saying? Incredulity toward meta-narratives. It looks like it could be applied to the Christian faith very clearly. There's your meta-narrative. That's not what he's saying, right? It's actually the idea that you're holding on to some idea of an external reason that can be grounded for everything, right? That's the meta-narrative you're telling yourself. So any logical structure, like last week we talked about Hegel's dialectic, right? The idea of a thesis, synthesis, that would be a meta-narrative. That's a meta-narrative. That's the idea of logic can just be fit within that equation, and we can appeal to that. Or, in Immanuel Kant, the idea of freedom and emancipation creates a meta-narrative, this way of understanding all things, and it should be universal and applied universally, right? And the critique here is that's the mythology. And so incredulity toward that overarching story is actually what the Christian faith is telling you to do. It's actually asking you to explore things through a particular context, right? That negates some one overarching way to just understand everything. It wants to include the experience of everyone. Is that sort of clear? I know that's, I feel like this is the one that I'm getting a little bit, I just see faces. Yeah. And this is where he gets it. So Smith, we'll go back to Smith and some of the quotes. Like the loquacious Ulysses Everett McGill, modernity and its science can't stop telling stories, right? So again, another one would be like Darwin and the Origin of Species, right? Darwin has provided some sort of empirical grounding for understanding. Well, that's a meta-narrative. That's a meta-narrative in of itself. It's telling a story about the way humanity is and the way it's evolved and how, survival of the fittest. And that's a logic that is imposed as though it's just uninterpreted. It's just what we see, and therefore we all have to accept it. But of course, that's not true, right? The moment Darwinism tries to ground itself, it has to contextualize. It has to tell itself a story, right? You're always returning to a narrative. You're always returning to a story. Meta-narratives, then, is the term Lyotard ascribes to these false appeals to the universal, rational, scientific criteria, as though they were divorced from any particular myth or narrative. For the postmodernist, every scientist is a believer. Okay? And so we return to this question of, why does this definition of postmodernity reject the Christian faith? And again, this is another quote from him. The answer is clearly negative, since the biblical narrative and Christian faith claim to be legitimated not by an appeal to a universal autonomous reason, but rather by an appeal to faith, or to translate myth or narrative. And that said, some might argue that Christian faith can be legitimated by reason. In evangelical apologetic discussion, for instance, classical or evidential apologists versus the presuppositionalists versus what we're trying to do might argue that the Christian faith is grounded in reason and thus constitutes a meta-narrative. But they've done this without rehearsing the history of debates regarding the apologetic method. I would argue that classic or evidentialist apologetics would fall prey to Lyotard's critique itself of meta-narratives. Does that make... So the idea that you are somehow trying to ground the Christian faith in just a logical expression of reason, that if everybody understood it, they'd get on board, that's a meta-narrative. It's devoid of the context, right? And you can't get there. That's an impossibility, because as Derrida has established, everything is within a context. Everything is within an interpretation, okay? And in a way, this actually brings us back to our thinking through ethics and the way that we understand that, right? If we consider, for instance, the reality of deep moral diversity and competing visions of the good, postmodern society is at a loss to adjudicate the competing claims. Maybe I'm getting too heavy with these quotes. All right. So maybe we'll move on to the next one here, because I hope that sort of makes sense. We're getting at this idea of Christian knowledge and understanding coming through faith, coming through the narrative contextual understanding, right? That we're given portraits. And it's pushing us back to this idea of faith-seeking understanding. Faith comes before we ground our understanding of what the Christian faith is. And so in that sense, Smith, again, is arguing Christians are the true postmodernists, if you're actually following through, because we are incredulous toward a modern denial of narrative, which subsequently we can never actually escape, okay? Now, I mean, does anybody, I'm curious if anybody just wants to push back on that. I mean, because I think that's the thing that we're driving at here. But is it clear to everybody that that's where we are? I think some people might come from, right? Yeah, take the microphone and give me a question there.
Not a pushback, but
Sure.
But what with postmodernity has been the biggest struggle for me. That kind of being a science guy and thinking myself as a reason guy. That the idea that there are no meta narratives, that there are things I feel like we're grounded in, and things that you are solid and we believe, and this idea that I may have had in the past, I don't think I do now, but if something challenges a Christian belief or idea that I've held on to, like the young creation idea, then my whole faith is in doubt, because it puts doubt in the Bible. And if you can't trust the Bible, then how can you trust anything? And then now my faith is in doubt. So, but the whole idea that there are no meta-narratives is a meta-narrative. That's a foundational belief. If someone says that, well, they've just stated a meta-narrative. So so that's a logic in the very statement there, that if there are no absolutes, well, that's an absolute statement.
Exactly, right. And that's where he's saying, right, it reverts it. That's where, is it truly postmodern? It's not necessarily, right? It's just doing the same thing at a larger scale. But that's part of the misunderstanding of meta-narrative as just being big story, and that's where people got that translation. Really, it's an appeal to some sort of universalized logic. And I'd be interested to, if you wanted to give an example, I mean, what you've just mentioned there, if somebody has that scientific understanding, that is a philosophical presupposition in a way that they then bring to bear on the text. It's the reason why would you get a literal reading out of Genesis if you haven't already presupposed this is the meta-narrative that it sort of fits in, right? That this is how it needs to be understood, and therefore that's how because can we name anything in the Christian faith that is, like, try and come up with an example of something that we confess to be true that is devoid of interpretation? I think it's impossible, right? And that's just sort of what we're getting at, is the fact that we have to realize that everything is embedded within this context. It always needs to ground itself in some reason for thinking it, right? Yeah, I don't know if that necessarily helps, but it's a way of saying your unease is correct in a sense because we want to be able to hold on to stuff. But it just has to go through the hard work of contextualization. And once we recognize that that's unavoidable, we will come up with better ways to approach it and to address it. And again, that's where I think Smith is pointing us back toward, where tradition and liturgy are ways in which we've tried to communicate those things, that we've tried to express their meaning through actual enacted ways of doing things, enacted being, Yeah, is that at all helpful?
Yeah. That helps. The other thing that I was thinking about is that people have lost trust. One of the things that led to postmodernity, I think, is people losing trust in institutions that they felt were solid and grounded. So people thought they could trust the church, and then the church let them down. People thought they could trust science, and then science let them down because science creates atomic weapons, and then when we have this idea that in science things are set and solid, and I have that idea a lot of times too, but science truly is if an experiment disproves a hypothesis or a theory, you're supposed to let go of it and change it.
Right.
And so this idea that when science says it, it's set and it's fixed, is not supposed to be the way. And then if something gets disproved in the sciences, well, then people say, well, we can't trust science anymore. And if we can't trust science anymore, well, we can't trust anything anymore. And that's another one of these things which I think led to postmodernity, that, well, we can't trust science because if science is changing, then how can we trust it? And if we can't trust science, we can't trust a religion, and we can't trust anything. So.
Right. But here again, science is being used within a narrative framework of, when you say people lost trust in science, well, they lost trust in that interpretation of science, right? That's what science is really doing. And that's precisely why I think what Smith is saying is that he's saying actually too many Christians, it's not just the atheist world out there, too many Christians are modernistic versions of Ulysses Everett McGill, that we are trying to hold on to these sorts of ways of understanding. We've imbibed modernity, and we can't let go of a Christianity that doesn't sort of rest on just a set of propositions that everyone needs to agree to. And the problem is that if you just see Christianity that way, as grounded that way, then if it lets you down, I can get rid of it because it's proved itself to be wrong. But it's more complex than that, right? I mean, and you and I, if you're here, you know that. Because you both recognize that the church has let us down continuously, and yet you all want to say it's like, well, that was just because it did something improper, right? It's not the actual expression of what the church really is. That's a complete interpretative frame, right? You're moving its context. You're saying when the church did the Crusades, it wasn't behaving as the Church of Christ, right? It doesn't fit my narrative. It fit their narrative. They called it Christianity. But you see, you can't just simplify that to a set of propositions. You can't just, and that's the problem, I think, is that it's what we often do with the faith, is that we go, here are the statements of the faith, and you just need to ascend to that proposition, and once you do, you'll be a Christian. And it's like, that doesn't constitute what belief really is, right? I bring him up tendentiously. But Jordan Peterson, he's kind of become famous for the evasion of the question. Everyone's always, because at first when he was starting to talk, and regardless of what you think about him, I mean, he started to do these religious lectures. And, he was constantly asked about, like, well, are you a confessional Christian? And he always kind of evaded the question of belief in God. But I think he was kind of right about what he was saying. He kept saying, like, well, what does it mean to believe in God? Believe in God isn't just a statement I make. It's a thing you have to be doing. right? It's contextual. Belief in God is not, I said the sinner's prayer and now I'm good. You know what I mean? Like I made the confession. It actually has to be something that is dictated by my behavior now. So like to say I believe in God is really to say I live as though there is one, right? Everything fits within those kinds of narrative contexts. So, and I think to what you're saying, I mean, this is something that Lyotard actually talks about in his philosophy, is that one of the issues is that he uses the language of we've computerized our knowledge. We've turned it into small sets of data that need to be simply understood, and if they can't be turned into those little micro bits of data, then I can just dispense them. I don't need it, because it's not making sense to me. I don't want to bother with that. Well, it's unfortunately, that's not the way that Christianity delivers itself. It can't be turned into some computerized little tidbit of information, right? That kind of goes back to, again, what we were saying last week about this erosion of deep literacy, this erosion of one of the issues we're facing in society is people want bite-sized tidbits of information, and we have Google to look at, and so I don't really need to bring anything within I don't need to, memorize and take in that information so that it can turn into wisdom and be brought out. And so Christianity just becomes a soundbite, and it's very easy to dispense with it. And you kind of look at Christians in the world and go like, well, they're a bunch of crazy fanatics. I mean, like, what, they believe a guy rose from the dead a bunch of years ago? Like, why even? It's a non-starter from the get-go because it's not being presented as a sort of narrative framework for understanding the world in which they live. It's a set of propositions. And I don't need to believe those propositions, right? And that's the challenge that you face in postmodernity, right? So we communicate our story through our behavior. We communicate our story through our worship. We communicate our behavior through loving one another in community, right? Until you can do that, you don't really have anything. And that's part of the postmodern critique that we need to, I think, take from, this is where we can benefit from it, is saying, if you're just going to go out into the world and just try and argue for the truth of the faith, I don't know that you're going to get very far. And I think it's purposely made that way. That's not to say, this is when we're talking a lot about apologetics, and really I am advancing. I mean, I think Karl Barth once said, apologetics is where good theology goes to die. And it's for this reason. It's that you're trying to fit God into that equation. I'm not saying that there's zero value to that, but it can't be all there is. So that's historical. For instance, like most apologetics circulates around like the belief in the empty tomb, right? Like, was Jesus raised from the dead? And then we look at history. Well, I agree as a person of faith, that does need to comport with history. Like, if they found me a body and we're like, that's Jesus, my faith has to change, right? It intersects with history. It's a real thing. But historical evidence is never going to be sufficient enough to claim that somebody was raised from the dead. I just at the end of the day, anyone in society already has a presupposition that doesn't happen and that you can't prove it empirically. I get to dispense with it because any story is more likely than a guy rose from the dead, right? You get that? I mean, I think we have to absorb that because otherwise, what kind of ammo do you have in the world, right? That's if we're just presenting the faith that way. It's not to say it's not true. I believe you will not, right? I think if you study the history, you're going to be amazed by how many things point to Christ really did rise from the dead. It actually becomes a very plausible explanation. But it'll never be fully proven. Right? It'll never, and it can't be, and we Christians shouldn't expect that it's like the evidence is insurmountable and you should all just agree. It's not going to be just that easy, right? I mean, some people might be persuaded, but I believe they would be because their hearts were open and because they understand this narrative a little bit. That's all I'm saying, is that the apologetic enterprise sort of has to be embedded within. It's more insular. It's, you give somebody who's open to the Christian faith and sees the beauty in it, then you can tell them all of the historical facts about the crucifixion and resurrection, and that probably will help solidify them. It did for me, I was already a person of faith. I went to Israel and I did the archaeological digs, and I was amazed by how well attested it is in history. But we recognize that's not a smackdown argument for anybody, because
Yeah, and I'm quite amazed at how we often miss that Jesus did exactly that. Like, he didn't really argue people in. He showed up. He
Right.
lived life. He allowed people, and even people that decided to walk away from him, they had an experience of
Yes.
him.
Yeah.
And I really think that that's what's been missing. I actually think that that's part of what postmodernity was trying to do, is bring the relational aspect of the faith back into things. They lost some things, but I think they try to do that. And even Paul, as much as we sort of look at Paul as maybe an arguer, but look what he did in Athens. Like, he walked
Yes.
around, looked at idols, and rather than trash them, which was the Old Testament way of doing things,
Yes.
he actually looked at them, took one, and says, I can actually tell you about what you're already experiencing.
Exactly.
This unknown God. And
Yeah.
it's Jesus.
And I think if you look at the arguments that he's making, he's not a modernistic apologist, right? He's not arguing like that. How is he arguing? I think that's important, right? How is he arguing for Christ's resurrection? Through the interpretive framework of fulfillment of prophecy of the Old Testament, for instance, right? Like, the one who you've all expected, that Christ is that person. He's fitting it within the narrative, right? He's not just going like, well, here's a set of facts. The tomb was empty on Sunday at 3 p.m. Like, he's not doing that. That's not what he means by argumentation. So when we say we need to have an apologetic of our faith, I think really what we're saying is the story needs to be presented in such a way, right? Because that's exactly it. Christ wasn't like taking selfies to make sure everyone knew, right? Like, picture it didn't happen, Jesus. Why didn't you show up in the 21st century when we could document this, right? That's not really what's at stake here. And that's, I think, what leads us more into the postmodern, is the fact that, like, well, Jesus' particularity and historicity is actually in a time where we can only get it through these portrait lenses, through the gospel, through the interpretive community, right? And that's a good thing. That's actually how we want to be. That's how Christ wants to be understood, right? Is through Christians, right? Who follow his teachings and follow that tradition. That gets us away from a lot of the fundamentalism, actually. I mean, one of the questions that was on one of our Christian theology exams at the university refers to John 8, or is it John 8? Sorry. Yeah, I believe so. The stoning of the woman, right? Okay, he who cast the first stone. In the original manuscripts that we have of John, that is absent from the text. So in our earliest Johannine manuscripts, okay? That poses a problem to some people, because they go like, well, can we trust it? It's not in the original manuscript. And some people want to evade that by kind of going like, well, it's okay for the Bible to be wrong. I don't like that answer. Really, the answer is that the text of the gospel is established by the Johannine community. That these stories, it says even in the Gospel of John, there are more stories that could fill numerous books, right? I mean, it's not like we've said everything. And the point is that there is an interpretive liberty that's actually being handed to the gospel writers themselves to say things that it's like, we're not worried about saying things verbatim in the sense of word for word, this is what he says, we get it right. It's we're saying what's true based on what Christ has given us and taught us, right? I don't think that means that the story of the woman caught in adultery and stuff is a false story, or that it didn't happen. I don't think you need to go make those claims. It's to simply say, and so people get hung up on the fact that they're like, well, you can't trust the Gospel of John. It's written 50 years after Christ. And it's like, how does that change? That doesn't change anything. Because the same community that witnessed all of these things has kept the tradition, the collective memory alive, and is communicating it to you in this theological presentation, this interpreted way to say this is how we understand it as a community. So that shouldn't do anything to shake, right? I mean, that shouldn't shake our faith. That should make it stronger in a sense. That that's precisely what the tradition was doing, is trying to theologize, trying to connect the narrative to the Old Testament and we're too much like Ulysses Everett here, trying to stick with modernity and just get to the facts of the matter, right? But it has to be contextualized. So there's also, one of the things I think that Smith is doing here is that there's a resistance then to a sort of evangelical pragmatism that tries to dumb everything down and simplify everything for the culture to understand. See, because what it's doing, I think, like maybe the way I've always put it, what apologetics ends up doing is that it leaves its communal language, enters the arena of the scientist, and then tries to argue for the faith using their grammar. And it's like, you can't do that. It never was playing that game. Do you understand? Right? It's always been embedded in the community to be understood this way. That's how it has to make sense using our grammar. Nothing is outside the text. That's why one of the reasons why saying nothing outside the text is, for Smith, just another way of upholding something like sola scriptura. It's far from it being some postmodern movement of resistance to any religious substructure, right? It actually moves into one of the main tenets of Protestantism. Sola scriptura. There's nothing outside the text. There's nothing outside the Bible. Right? The Bible explains itself. It interprets itself. That's part of its tradition, contextual understanding, right? That's what we need to pour ourselves into. Yeah, I get that might be difficult to wrap our heads around, but I think it's freeing. It's very liberating to come into that kind of understanding. You're not trying to wrestle everything down to the ground. You're trying to understand what's really being communicated through these stories as being a higher ordered truth, if that makes sense. If that makes sense seems to be my catchphrase throughout all of these. Anyway. Okay, good. Yeah.
Does that, sorry, just on that note, I feel like you can follow that logic incorrectly to say anything outside of the Bible has no value.
And that's, I think, that's the issue with the sort of bumper sticker analogy, or like understanding of it, is that if we just leave it at the reduced kind of idea of nothing outside the text, you might have license to go say, well, that means there's just all kinds of, you can make anything mean whatever you want it to mean, right? Or precisely, everything outside of the Bible is its own, everything is a text, so there is no thing called the Bible that's exclusive, right? Yeah. Is that not what you were asking? I mean, what were you...
No, I think just that idea that being brought up on, other religions of going, well, there's no value in another religion.
Right, exactly. Yes.
It's not biblical.
Yes. Right, exactly.
Where, meditation is a great example of that,
yep.
Which does exist in the Bible. But, when I was brought up on, meditation was what the Buddhists did, and what the Buddhists do is not right. So we don't do that.
Exactly.
Where now that is part of my...
And I think what's being said here, again, going back to let's go loot the Egyptians. Let's go, all truth is God's truth. Let's go into understanding where actually some of those expressions from even other faiths are articulating for us deep Christian truths. Now, of course, you're not going to take it all the way down. It's not your interpretive community, but it does help us understand the difference. Like a huge issue, and this was something that I saw again and again by a lot of fundamentalist Christians or people who were really stuck with that sort of evangelical pragmatism and kind of had a simple, flat reading of the text, is they would make that argument, right? When religious extremism was happening in Islam, they would go, well, that's just the proper interpretation of the Quran. If you read the Quran and really follow it to its end, you'll be this violent terrorist. And that's an incredibly xenophobic way of reading that. But recognizing the postmodern critique and recognizing, I think, what people like Jamie Smith are trying to say is you would recognize immediately, well, that's not how religion functions. That's an interpretive community understanding the text that way. That's a fundamentalist way of understanding the Quran. And there are many Islamic people, there are many Muslims who do not understand it that way whatsoever. And it actually is a religion of peace for many. I think with this understanding, we can open ourselves up to that dialogue. That can be made apparent, right? It's only through a very narrow, modernistic, rational universalist framework that one could look at Islam and make them the enemy of everything because, well, this is what your faith says. I'm not telling somebody else what their faith means, right? I mean, it's just like you're not in the community. You don't understand the grammar, right? And you can see where that still, though, doesn't mean that you can't, I'm going to condemn ISIS, and I'm going to condemn it as a poor interpretation. but that it's organized by a sort of everything is within a context. So again, we're trying to get to that place of saying, like, this doesn't lead us to just pure relativism. And indeed, that's not necessarily what these postmodernist thinkers are trying to do. It does destabilize things a little bit, but it fits us within, I think, the proper context that the Bible has always been situated in. And I think that's where Jamie Smith's argument that it's like postmodernity is really just the same thing that Augustine was already kind of dealing with and doing. The early church was already understood all of this. That's why its tradition was the way that it was. That's why we have 4 gospels, and it's only in the modern period where people are like, well, these contradict each other, as if the early church didn't know, or like they didn't see that before, and we're like, it does, like it's not the way it's understood. So let's, as we continue to talk about this, let's go to the last point, which is Michel Foucault and his understanding of power. And I'm going to try not to look at the text because I feel like that's when I get a little bit lost and bored. Francis Bacon gave the term knowledge is power. You probably know that. Knowledge is power. All right, the more knowledge we have, the more power we have. And so, you teach that to your kids. The more you can understand, the more, integrity you have, and the better you're able to articulate yourself. That's all very good. Foucault is switching that around and saying that power is knowledge. All knowledge comes to us because it all comes to us in a narrative framework or in a contextualized framework. It is always given to us by some authority or some power. And so power and knowledge are not the same thing, but they imply each other, is basically what Foucault is trying to get at. He's trying to say that power relations are inescapable. And I think this is one of the more important points that he is making, that again, Christianity can try and absorb and understand. So I'm going to try and simplify this the best way that I can. The movie illustration he gives this time is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? Jack Nicholson, okay. And so to break down Foucault is a critic of the way in which institutions organize themselves as systems in power relations, okay? So he has got his eye set on prisons and hospitals and, any kind of institution, really, okay? Banks, whatever you want to say. But prison specifically is one of the examples that he's going to use, but he's not really just talking about prison systems themselves. He's in a way using the prison system as a way of saying this mirrors society itself. And the image that you see there, this right here, is something called the panopticon. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that term or heard of it. It's basically the idea that you would have, it's this constant state of surveillance. So all the prison cells are in a circle, and the person in the middle is watching, but you don't know when they're watching. And that's the whole point, is that they themselves are shielded. So it's like the watchful eye, right? Like Lord of the Rings. It's like it's always gazing. It's always looking. It's keeping you under a state of surveillance. And Foucault is basically trying to say about institutions that they have a way of administering discipline by keeping us in conformity to the way that they interpret things. So, Ren, you're talking about narratives. The idea of conformity, normalcy and abnormality are the new modern ways of interpreting things to keep everything in order. So rather than in the Middle Ages, the idea of like we torture and punish somebody, and the reason why we apply torture to them is to get at the truth, right? Because they'll confess the truth if we torture them. In today's society, we use the idea of we point at somebody and call them abnormal, and hopefully that'll get the society. If everyone in society can deem something abnormal, we'll get them to conform to what is normal. Foucault, I'm going to say, of the 3 thinkers, for me, is the most dangerous. He's the most dangerous in the sense that, and again, I think it's because he's right about some of the critiques that he's making about institution and power relations. The reason why I think he's the most dangerous is because if we don't fit what Foucault is saying in his critique within a Christian understanding of power and power dynamics and power relations, you end up with a sort of what you now see in society as everything is always about a power dynamic and power being toppled. So all that can ever happen in society, if power relations are inescapable, is you will always have the battle of the oppressed to take over the oppressor, and then somebody has to take over that power, and then somebody has to take over that power, and it's just constant domination, right? You just constantly have this movement of, and it's why, today in society, I don't know if I'm jumping too far ahead, so slow me down if you need me to, but today in society, we have this idea of putting the victim on a pedestal, right? This idea of I want to be the victim, that's embedded in Foucault's understanding. You have to be the victim because there's only there's only power and non-power, right? And so if you're the victim and you win, that makes, you're now the dominant one, you're the next person to get knocked off the pole, right? So you have to remain victim. You can never be satisfied even if you're handed the win. You got to remain the victim in Foucault's sort of ideological framework. Does that make sense? There's that question again. Yeah, right. So
what's the gain of being the victim?
It's the fact that power, what's the gain of being the victim, he's saying, is that it's necessarily, if you're constantly caught in the binary of you are in one of two categories, you're either the one in power or you're the one being oppressed. The whole game is to take, but if you topple the power, that puts you in power. That means you're the one who needs to be toppled now. Right? You're now the one you're the one who needs to be taken off because you're constantly in a state of we're always seeking the next revolution. So if I don't know how far I want to go with this, but you can see sort of with certain ideological movements, this kind of the statement that well, we're the victims and we're the oppressed. And it's I see your flag on every street corner. What are you talking about? Everyone knows what I'm talking about. But, and I don't mean that to be a jab. I'm just trying to say I think it's sort of embedded into the framework of what we're seeing here, is that everything is a power relation. Let me try and explain this a little bit better using the analogy. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jack Nicholson's character is his very problem, according to the institution, is the fact that he doesn't think he has a problem. He sees himself as normal. He sees himself as I'm a bit of a weird guy according to societal standards, but just because I'm a little abnormal according to you, I don't need to be conformed to anything. And so Foucault is, in a sense, the analogy that Smith is making is that Foucault is Jack Nicholson's character. What's his name? I'm trying to remember. Anybody remember the movie well enough? McMurphy, I think his name? Randall McMurphy. That's right. So Foucault is Randall McMurphy. He's the one fighting against this oppressive power of conformity that is constantly surveilling him and constantly trying to fix him, even though he doesn't need to be fixed. And that's his whole point, right? And that's why, you can kind of see Foucault's ideology kind of spread itself out into this champion of diversity and the idea that there is no abnormal. We're all just different expressions of different things. And so conformity to anything is a bad thing if you're taking him at that, right? So here's the quote that Smith gives. On the mental ward of this Oregon hospital, Chief, everybody remember the character Chief from the movie? Chief, a longtime resident, is able in a way to see through the walls and can thus observe the hospital's machinations of power firsthand. Even the strategies aimed towards cure are in fact systems of control and domination. From the orderliness to the medication, from the strict schedule and work regimen to the therapeutic circle that serves only to humiliate, all performed to the tune of a banal background music that functions as the soundtrack for repression. So you can see it's a very negative picture that he's obviously painting. And in One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, it is a very negative picture, right? They're trying to get people to conform to something, and you can see it as very manipulative and in a sense wrong. And it's Miss Ratchet, right? She's the nurse who operates this whole thing. And she operates and dominates through a pattern of surveillance and punishment, okay? Her office with its cameras is the panopticon. You're constantly being surveillance, but you're not sure when, right? Constantly watching you. And so she sees her character is, in a sense, not just an individual, but she's representative of a much larger system of the institution itself that uses power to control, okay? But states its goal as healing and cure, right? So it's giving you the idea that it's a healing and a cure. And Chief represents to it refers to the institution as a shop for repair, okay? So it treats the inmates as though they're sort of like robotic machinery. And this is the language that Foucault sort of uses, that society is installing things into us that then dictate the way that we should behave so that we'll all conform, right? And that's when Randall McMurphy comes in and sort of upsets this order, right? And what needs most repair in Randall, as I've said, is the very idea that he doesn't think he needs any repair whatsoever, okay? He resists the attempts of the institution, and others begin to follow him. So he's this revolutionary figure, and that's where Foucault is kind of, a similar type. But unfortunately, how does the movie end? The movie ends with him getting a lobotomy, right? And the victory, it's a depressing ending in many ways, the victory of the institution. And for all of his tenacity, he cannot stop the cogs of the machine from working, right? And so that's kind of embedded as well in Foucault, is the fact that it's like this thing is steamrolling, and it's almost impossible to stop the momentum of society and its institutions, okay? All right, so Foucault is the Randall McMurphy of our sort of unholy trinity of postmodern thinkers there. And in a way, this is how he was kind of known, right? He was a bit of a sexual liberationist and a rebel who was trying to poke holes in institutional powers, okay? And I think what we need to understand is the scope of what Foucault is talking about again here, that the birth of the prison, the idea of the panopticon and the prison system, is not just about penitentiaries, but about the way society as a whole reflects this prison, okay? So it's a much larger analogy. It watches us now more than ever. Okay? I mean, think Foucault's writing in the 70s. He doesn't even have the iPhone, okay? Right, where everything is being tracked. Your data is being tracked constantly, okay? And it expects a certain conformity from us. It wants us to act in a certain way. And we want to fit into certain categories, hospitals, schools, businesses, etc. Okay, so that's where he's reversing Francis Bacon's, from knowledge is power to power is knowledge, okay? But, again, resisting a sort of bumper sticker slogan here, power and knowledge not being the same thing, power is never neutrally determined, okay? That needs to be sort of understood. And that's why he can say power is knowledge, because he's saying all power fits within an organized set. Again, it fits within a contextual narrative of what constitutes power in a given environment, okay? Knowledge is constituted within the network of power. If you get knowledge, if you're receiving knowledge right now, so you think, you're receiving it from me because somehow I appeal as an authority in some way based on your understanding of the world, okay? Power and knowledge imply one another. When power is used, it is an exercise of control of a whole field of knowledge. So Foucault is talking more about power-knowledge relations, or a nexus of power and knowledge informing each other, okay? And in a way, so there's two kinds of ways to read Foucault that I think this is what Smith is presenting, is that you could read him as just plainly being descriptive, doing a genealogy. This is sort of, he says this is the Nietzschean way to read him, is that he's just sort of presenting something that he sees out there empirically, and this is the way that it is. The other way to read this is that he's really implying something quite negative and being awfully critical of the whole thing, right? That he's actually following a sort of Kantian and Marxist critique of society. And I think that's probably the correct way to look at this, is that Foucault is not painting a very nice picture here, is he, right? And he is very critical of society, and so he's actually encouraging us in some ways to rebel against these institutional powers or whatever he's talking about, okay? And that's why I think it's so dangerous, by the way. I think it's so, because this idea that somehow we should then resist any instance of an idea of abnormality, and that conformity is always a problem because power is always a problem, the Christian, I think this is where Smith is going to come in and kind of ask the question, well, is that entirely true? If he might be right about the fact that you can never escape power relations, but is power always bad? Right? How do we understand godly power? How do we understand, right, self-sacrificial love as power? That's sort of the difference that we got to nudge toward. This is where Foucault's critique might inform again, but it can help us if we understand it, if we loot it, right? If we take it for, take the critique seriously. This is something that I think you find in a lot of Christian circles, is that there's been this movement to therefore go, Christians in general have to work against oppression. We need to topple these powers, and we be all about social justice and stuff like that. But what ends up happening is that there's this dismantling of all hierarchy across the board. It's like a pure egalitarianism. And what I think you find in the Bible is not that. I don't think you find the dismantling of hierarchy. I think you find the inversion of hierarchy, but it's a very different thing. So when Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first, there's still a hierarchy there, isn't there? And in a sense, this is where hierarchy is not necessarily a bad word. I think Foucault thought maybe it was. But for the Christian, that's not really the case, right? That the authority of God the Father is not an oppressive power, right? It doesn't work that. And one of the ways in which we differentiate that, and this is what Smith is saying, is that he's saying worldly powers, as opposed to, let's say, God's power, has a very different teleology, has a very different end goal in mind. What is it trying to get the person to become? What is it trying to conform it to? So if you reduce things in society and say, well, let's say the capitalist system is trying to get you to conform to a certain way of being that wants to turn you into a consumer and define you by that, that's very problematic, right? And so you want to resist against that. But is that a critique across the board about all kinds of conformity? Conformity to the religious or Christian ethos, what's its end goal? It wants you to be a full human being, right? That Christianity is trying to get us to fall more and more, to be formed more and more into the image of God. And because that's its teleological frame, that's because that's its endpoint, conformity to it is actually a very good thing. So what Foucault is basically offering simply is saying we need to reckon with the idea that power relations are never going away. Everything is a power relation. But what power do you want to follow, right? And so this is where I think Smith has the sort of freedom then to move into saying the right way to address this is by being more confessional, by actually moving more into conformity with the specifics of our faith, right? Because Christ, again, there's the scandal of the particular. Christ is a particular person in a particular place with a particular faith-based tradition. And to lean into that more is to be in conformity with something that we're recognizing we have to conform, in a sense, to something, right? You're never going to escape it. So what do you conform yourself to? Well, the Christian model is the one model that's going to lead to freedom and flourishing of the human spirit, right? As opposed to the other reductionistic models presented by society. If you don't have the Christian worldview, or if you don't have that religious substructure, you can see, though, where Foucault's critique can just lead to, I think, crazy rebellion and revolution, right? You had a question there, Gavin?
Actually, I think you answered it.
Okay.
I was going to make the claim that Jesus did actually come to overpower, but you're right.
Yeah, right.
When I think of what he said about the coin, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, he did it in a vastly different way than our revolutions do it.
Yes.
That's sort of what I'm hearing you say, that his revolution did not dismantle as much as
subvert.
Use the word subvert.
Subvert, yeah. And that's exactly, I think that's exactly the case, right? Jesus comes to do battle, but he does it with principalities and powers not of this world. I think that it's a reorienting of how we look at these things. So we're near the end here, and I mean, obviously there's a lot more to say, and I should only unpack it if it's needed. But I think you get kind of the basic premise. I'll move very quickly then to just sort of the conclusions that Smith is making here. He's asking the question, as I mentioned then, about power dynamics. Should we accept just this purely negative view of power? Is power all bad? Specifically, can Christians share in this devaluation of power and discipline as inherently evil? Can we who claim to be disciples, who are called and predestined to be conformed to the likeness of the Son, be opposed to discipline and formation as such? Right? It's a very different kind of discipline, right? And that's the issue, is if the church looks like the hospital in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, then we have a problem, right? But that's not, maybe that's just the wrong interpretation of the institution of the church. It doesn't need to function that way. Can we who are called to be subject to the Lord of life really agree with the liberal Enlightenment notion of the autonomous self? Are we not above all called to subject ourselves to our Domine, our Lord, and conform to his image? And so this idea that you are called not to conform to the patterns of this world, Romans 12:2, or to our previous evil desires, 1 Peter 1:14, okay, is not a call to non-conformity, but to an alternative conformity through a counter formation that comes in Christ. And so, again, to kind of cut to the chase at the end here with the concluding thoughts is that Smith pushes us then to a whole other stream known as radical orthodoxy. And this is something that we don't really have time to get into and question, but again, it's this idea of holding on to and moving more into our traditions. Maybe this quote will be helpful here. The pathos of modern theology is a false humility. Once theology surrenders its claim to be a meta-discourse, it cannot any longer articulate the word of the Creator God, but is bound to turn in some oracular voice of some finite idol, such as historical scholarship, humanist psychology, or transcendental philosophy. This is a heavy quote, I understand. I'll try and unpack it. If theology no longer seeks to position, qualify, or criticize other discourses, then it is inevitable that these discourses will position theology. And the whole idea there is if we take Foucault's understanding and critique of all of these sort of systems of social organization and institutions of power, and we reduce our understanding to what that kind of societal conformity, then theology is just going to become another product of those things. And so what radical orthodoxy was trying to do was, in a sense, return theology to what was the queen of the sciences, trying to say theology is the one that has to reorganize these other understandings of our society, of the social sciences itself. And I just want to offer the fact that in the last 10 years, people have been very, very critical of radical orthodoxy because they were worried that what ended up happening with people like Milbank is that enterprise became imperialistic, that it was returning theology to the queen of the sciences was something that we had to take by force, and we have to do it otherwise, right? And so a lot of people were actually very skeptical of this. And